Assalamualaikum and a very good evening to everyone. Yang berhormat Lim Kit Siang, Yang berhormat Tony Pua, Yang berhormat Anthony Loke, and ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I'd like to thank DAP for inviting me to speak in tonight's forum, JPA Scholarships, seeking a fair and equitable policy. In 2005, I wrote in Jeff Wee's blog a letter to Jeff Wee in 2005. Before both of us became Yang Berhormat, and we were merely bloggers at that time. The fiasco of SPM high achievers being overlooked by the authorities in the awarding of scholarships can now be gauged like clockwork. Each year, the authorities announce the list of scholarship recipients, and we can see a huge brouhaha among the public. And true enough, this thing remains the same until this year. I think at the end of the day, when we focus on the issue of scholarships, the main issue at hand is the transparency on how people are awarded scholarships. People want to know, how can you get the scholarships from the government? We need to understand the criteria on how the students are selected. Just now we learned in detail, even I wasn't aware of a lot of the nitty-gritty details, because it probably changes every year on how the scholarships are being awarded. But these things need to be put at the forefront at the awarding of scholarships, so that people know and people understand. I think that is a very crucial thing when we discuss the issue about scholarships. I also think that it's important, while I agree the need that we need to reform the system, that the system needs to be more transparent, it needs to be more just, we also must understand that scholarships, especially when you talk about overseas scholarships, in a sense it's a privilege rather than a right, because of its limited nature. Now, I mean, at least at my time, it was very difficult. 10A1 is a very rare thing. Not as rare as Tony's time, he's a bit older than me. But certainly it's not as common as it is now. But now you have so many people getting 10A1s, and you have 2,000 scholarship please. But at the end of the day, I think that all high achievers should be given the chance to attend and to be invited for a scholarship interview. Beyond that, as I said, obviously the performance in the interview will become a factor along with the academic results and other extracurricular issues can be clarified. And I'm sure that the public in general can be more appreciative of the challenges faced by the JPA and see the bigger picture of the whole. Like so many issues in Malaysia, the debate on scholarship becomes wrapped up in the underlying racial polemics. But I would say, I would bear in mind that to be able to move forward, to be able to get this debate to go forward, we must bear in mind that it is very simplistic to see that the Malays are merely the beneficiaries from this policy. It's a bit more complicated than that. But first, going on to history, undoubtedly the birth of the Malay middle class today owes largely to this policy. Furthermore, locally, a smaller proportion, we also need to look, we always talk about the foreign scholarships, obviously that's the most prestigious scholarships people vie for. But when you talk about local scholarships, which used to be very broad, almost automatically previously among the Malay students, if you get into a local university, you get a scholarship. But today, today a smaller proportion of even among the Malay students benefit from scholarships, whereas most of the students today, they rely on PTPTF, which is the student loan scheme, which is another problem on its own, and among the local students, it's a very, very big problem. So I think the main issue here is that we should not put this as a racial zero-sum game. It should not be seen as a racial issue. At the end of the day, I believe every community, when you talk about the issue of justice, you talk about the issue of merit, if you can make the right arguments, you can say it the right way, if you have the courage of conviction, they can be convinced. I've seen how Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim in his speeches with 30,000 Malays, not in Taman Tun, but in places like Kedah or Kelantan, when he says, is it fair that a son of a Malay Datuk gets a place in university, whereas Indian rubber tapper does not get a place simply because of the race, whereas the Indian rubber tapper scores a higher mark than the Malay, then the crowd can agree. But unfortunately, people in UMNO do not understand this. They do not have the courage of conviction. Even people who do not need the NEP like Khairi Jamaluddin do not have the courage of conviction to say this, because they are so trapped in the racial game that is in UMNO. So when you want to appeal, you go to MCA. So it's a very nice setup that you have in Barisan Nasional. But we have to move beyond that. But we also have to see about how to attract scholars home as part of the issue. As I've said, being a recipient of scholarship, I've always believed that there needs to be a major revamp in the issue. When we look again, back, if you look from the Malay perspective, many bright young Malays get a scholarship from JPA or get the scholarships of GLCs. But as a result, they get bonded, they're stuck with either the GLCs or JPAs, and they do not get exposed to the private sector. I had people, friends, coming to me from Citibank and whatnot, trying to hire top Malays, but they say that most of the fresh graduate Malays will be trapped in one form of a scholarship or another. So they do not get the exposure to the private sector. So previously, okay, it played a role in creating a Malay middle class, but now when you talk about the challenges of the 21st century, you talk about getting Malays to work in competitive world-class firms, it's actually a constraint, because most of the Malays will be stuck in all, either in the government sector or in the GLCs, which is, which do not provide them the best exposure. But it also, so it only reinforces the racial dichotomy. So the private sector again becomes overwhelmingly non-Malay, and the public and GLC become overwhelmingly Malay. It just reinforces the set dichotomy rather than address it. A lot of PhD scholars, unlike GLC scholars, they are allowed to go away. And a lot of them go overseas, even among the Malay students, simply because they do not find coming back as something which is appealing to them, which is attractive to them. And this is again another issue. We've spent so much money, of taxpayers' money, to send these people to get the best education abroad. I would say that we would at least expect them at a certain point, at least, to come back and contribute to the country. They can work in the private sector, but at least contribute to the country in one way or another. But we cannot just see this as trying to force them, or it's a matter of patriotism. We have to be very commonsensical about this. We have to make it attractive for the scholars to come back and serve. Also, we should not be too too rigid about this. We can allow them to work. I mean, it's a great experience. Before the economic crisis, it was glamorous to become an investment banker in London. Now, not so much, I think. But previously it was, and all this, I mean, or work in Silicon Valley, there's a lot of bright young Malaysians, including Malays, working in these places. I mean, why not allow them to work there, gain the experience there, and then come back to Malaysia and contribute? Because if you're a fresh graduate, you perhaps have less to contribute than you are with some working experience behind you. So you should allow some flexibility, but rather than penalize the people, you should get them to come back. But again, if the students do not want to come back and serve, then I think it's fair that GLCs can claim the amount and whatnot because they invested such an amount. I think that's only fair. And it's also fair that the students pay back the sponsors that send them, since that is also not their money, but it's the people's money, and there are other scholars further down the line who want to mind on the need to balance sending students abroad and investing in our own local education system. If there's nothing wrong in Singapore, for example, a lot of people go overseas because they cannot get a place in the NUS. I wish that they will come through when people go overseas just because they cannot get a place in UM, because people really want to go to local universities. And I think that's something that we should consider in the long term. That should be taken part into the consideration of the subject. So the issue of scholarships cannot be viewed in isolation from the broader issues of higher education reform in the country. Furthermore, private corporations too should move in. They do now, but more in terms of getting tax exemptions or a PR thing. But they should also see giving scholarships as their investment in the Malaysian human capital. Because when you have better talents in Malaysia, that will benefit the economy as a whole, will benefit each Malaysian corporation. A great flaw in the Malaysian thinking towards scholarships is that they tend to veer towards absolutes. Some believe it should be completely meritocratic, while others feel it should be based on ethnic demographics or financial need. The best possible solution, in my opinion, lies somewhere in between, where all talented students should be given a chance to study. It is also important to ensure that young people from disadvantaged groups, from the Orang Asli, from the people in Sabah and Sarawak, from poor Malays, Chinese and Indians in the countryside, in the squatter areas, to be given a chance to join this body of scholars.